Mark, what does being a great session player mean to you?
Adaptability. You know, I say it all the time. I tell myself it's a service industry. I think some people come here with the thought that they're going to do their thing, and you can do that to a certain degree, create your own sound, do all that. But when it all comes down to it, when you're sitting there in the chair on a session, and you got an artist and a producer and, you know, a team of other session players, you got to serve the song, serve the artist, serve the producer. And that sounds like a benign statement, but it's really not. It's so active. It's constant. You know, you got to constantly serve that song and serve whoever called you and whoever's going to call you back.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Absolutely.
You know, and if you get too married to a part, it's bad news because they can feel that, you know, if you're hesitating on making a change for them. So I just, all the time, I'm like, don't get married to what you're doing. You know, don't get so in love with it you can't flop over and play something different for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be the most simple, mundane thing that they want to hear, but that's how they're hearing their song. So
right.
In a word, service.
Absolutely.
Serve the song, serve the artist, serve the producer, serve the band, you know.
So as a kid, where did your first influences for music come from that allowed you to be in a position today where you're able to serve the song and adapt in a variety of ways?
Well, I think, you know, I grew up in a somewhat musical family. We had a little gospel band and we traveled around. And eventually we came down here and did a record, like very, very, you know, small scale kind of thing. But I played on that when I was 11 years old at a studio here in town.
Wow.
So, and it was great, man. My family played on it, but we hired these supplemental session players. And they, like, I think it was a guitar player and an acoustic player, one of which was Bruce Watkins, who I still work with today. It's great.
Wow.
But he tuned my bass for me. He was awesome. But I saw these guys sit and listen to these songs and script. They didn't do a chart on a full page. They just put all the songs, just little bitty charts on one page. It was amazing. And they played these songs back to us like that. And I was just like, at 11 years old, I was like, that is cool. And so we came back when I was 16 or 18, somewhere in there, and we hired all session players. Mike Brignardello, killer bass player here in town, that we've become friends. He played on it. And he was so kind to me. He was like, he let me check his bass out. He showed me his chart. And I watched him play this. He created these parts and played them back to me so quickly. I was like, that's what I want to do. There was no question in my mind. I didn't want to be a live guy. I wanted to work in the session where you create the stuff.
Then once you figured out that was what you wanted to do, was there some type of preparation that you started working on to get to that? What was your first step?
Learning songs. Sitting down and learning the song verbatim, what was going on, the feel, you know, how is the bass working in this song. And then, of course, I started, you know, I was with my family for up until I was 20 or so. And that's another long story, how that kind of dismantled. But I started playing clubs, you know, because I felt like I've got to season myself. I gotta work my way up to that. I didn't feel like I was qualified by any means at that time to walk into a studio. So I just started playing in bands, you know, club bands, as much as I could, working in a music store during the day where I could sit and play and hook, you know, network with other players, not here, up back where I was from, and just start honing the craft.
What were some of the ways that got you into some of your first sessions?
I had come here a few times in 1989. I moved here in 90. So I had come here a few times just kind of sniffing around, seeing what was going on, and I'd met a few people. And I knew I wanted to be in sessions, and I was really vying for that. So I did get a couple of session calls pretty early on, and man, it just started snowballing because I was so hyper-focused on making that statement, like, I am a session dude. In
that process of that coming together, it sounds like it happened fairly swiftly for you.
And organically, really. I never made calls to people. Mm-hmm. That was definitely not my MO. You know, I think people will call whatever, other players and like, can you get me on this? And the only call I ever made was if I'd been out on tour for a while and there was a certain group of producers that used me regularly, I would just call them and say, hey, I'm back in town. You know, I'm here. I'm available. Mm-hmm. So I never called anybody asking for work. That just didn't seem right to me.
You know, when you're in your early days of music, I think we all kind of fall towards or are lean towards certain genres, certain styles of music. Were you always someone that was very eclectic in the music that you listened to, or did you have to make a, you know, kind of intentional focus on expanding your musical vocabulary?
I think once you get here and realize how vast what you're going to be doing every day is, you do start digging in more. But I always had an eclectic taste. Like I can dig Earth, Wind, and Fire like nobody's business, and then listen to Frank Sinatra and go, wow, so cool.
Right.
Like listen to what the swing of the upright, what it's doing. And an old school country Merle Haggard tune, I can get lost in that too. So I think it is a definite prerequisite of a session player to have eclectic taste.
So it's really important to be eclectic and diverse, but I imagine there's some importance in still having some type of signature thing or something that people kind of think about you for. How do you stand out in a world where you're supposed to be so eclectic? Yeah,
well, it's all about that being adaptive thing too, right? That's so important. Mm-hmm. But if there was one word I would say that people think of me, it would be tone. You know, serving the song with this growly kind of Fender tone. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that changes. You know, sometimes I'll play a Hofner bass or sometimes I'll play a Rickenbacker, whatever it is, but it's still fundamentally meat. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah. And, you know, I'll change that up a little bit. Sometimes there won't be any distortion on it. Sometimes it'll be super clean and punchy, but it's always very fundamental and foundational. Mm-hmm. You know, and I get that all the time. Man, I just mixed a tune you played on and I just turned the fader up. You know, not a lot you have to do to it. Mm-hmm. It's pretty much baked in.
How much would you say the tone comes from your hands? And
90%
versus, or were there any things that you remember starting to discover in the way that you approach playing that help with tonality?
Well, I will say the common denominator since I've been here 30 some odd years. And I've tried to get away from it, but always come back to it, is a Neve 1073. And it's not like I'm heavily EQing it or anything. I'm not grinding that mic pre that much, but it's just, I got away from it, tried an API for a while. It's like, oh, that's good, but let me hear this again. Wow. That's more my thing, mm-hmm. You know. When I play with a pick, which is quite a bit, it's a Herco 75. Like I've tried other picks, and you know I can use them, but there's something about those picks. You know, they're hard but flexible. I guess that's why they call it a Flex 75, because it digs in, and I play hard with a pick, but it still moves with you. Like, you know, I can still be kind of fluid with it. Mm-hmm. Where if I used a Fender heavy pick, it's like, oh wow, I can't do my thing.
Yeah, that's great. So with a preamp, do you bring a rack with you that
on cartage days? So in my cartage rig, Neve 1073 distressor, and in front of that is the Brett Teagarden's Fat Boy DI, which those are great, mm-hmm. Love them. And a pedal board that's about yay big, not a whole lot of stuff. A couple mm-hmm. of distortion pedals, killer tuner, which is very very important. Always tune for the song. You know, like where am I going to be playing the most? You know, I always kind of tune there. Mm-hmm. How hard am I going to be playing? You know.
So what kind of tuner do you use?
Peterson. I like the Strobo tuners, Turbo tuner. Those are good too. But the Peterson, man, killer. Mm-hmm. The new HD Stomp pedal.
Is there anything specific about it that stands out to you?
It's just so freaking accurate and so quick.
And so the rest of your pedal board, you have a few different distortion pedals that you like?
Yeah, the two that I like the best is the VT. It's the SVT pedal by Tech 21. Basically, their model of the SVT pedal, but it's so much more broad than that. You can make it sound like a flip top, the old Ampeg flip tops, mm-hmm. and it's got a lot of control. And then the I can't remember the name of that company, but it's called a Bass Juice. It's just a distortion pedal, yellow, and I have both of those linked together and on a true bypass on my control unit. So when I'm not using those, it's not going through it. Mm-hmm. It's not degrading any tone at all. But yeah, I can turn that on the pedal, and then I can either use both of them at the same time or one or the other.
And when you're using distortion together or in a serial order, what's the approach that you're taking there?
Just different levels of, gack. And sometimes, like if it's pretty hearty, like a really good rock thing, I'll have both those pedals on, harmonic distortion on the distressor, and I've gained the Neve up a little bit, so I'm hitting it pretty hard. But in the track, it's just like, it's just butter, it's so good. Mm-hmm. And I'm that usually gets a comment or two, like, "Oh my God, how are you doing that?" And I'm just like, everything's on, all the lights are on, so it works.
Yeah.
And then there's an octaver pedal, like the old Boss Brown octaver. And sometimes I will turn that on where it's really not audible, like especially on a pop track, and where there's a sub octave underneath it. You don't really hear it as much as you feel it in the track.
Yeah. So is that the core of what's on your?
Yeah, and then my secret weapon, the EBS multi-comp, which is on 98% of the time. Mm-hmm. And it's not really doing much. It just, like, especially in front of a Neve, because a Neve is kind of slow. Like, it's slow, it has a slow rate. Mm-hmm. That compressor pedal speeds it up a little bit. It's almost like having best of both worlds of a Neve and an API. You know how API is real quick and punchy?
Right.
Which is great. But you miss out on the Neve. This kind of adds it together.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense.
And so is that right? So you're running into that before the pre?
It's also on a loop on the control unit. Mm-hmm. And that pedal tends to be a little noisy if you're running through it and it's not on. So I have that on that control unit where I can click that button and it's not going through the pedal at all.
Gotcha.
But it's on 98% of the time. There's only a few basses. Like if I play, I love Music Man basses. And if I play one of those, I turn that off because those are kind of pointed, sounding punchy basses anyway. Mm-hmm. So I don't really need that, Right. But the old Fenders, it helps perk it up in the track a little bit.
So bass instrument-wise, it sounded like you leaned towards Fenders early on, and now you have a little bit of a arsenal of stuff.
For sure.
When did it become important to have a few different tools?
Pretty early on. There's certain producers, like back in the 90s, there was a producer I worked for all the time that it was one bass. He just liked this bass, and I would just kind of carry that and maybe one other one to a session. But now it's just so diverse, and there's so much going on, different kinds of music, that on a cartage date, I've got 8 basses there maybe. Hofner, Rickenbacker, Gibson EBO, which I can make that bass almost sound like an upright. A couple of P basses, a couple of jazz basses. One jazz bass that's suits a 63 original jazz bass, super vintage sounding. But then I've got a more modern sounding P bass or jazz bass that's a little more for rock,
If you were starting today, what recommendation would you give for someone that's getting into it as far as like what to have as their basic,
bass wise
groups of basses to bring in?
I would, you got to have a great P bass, right? It's like a Chevy truck. It just always works. It's always there. Mm-hmm. And a good P bass will work on anything, On the other hand, a jazz bass, you can kind of make sound like a P bass, but you can't make a P bass sound like a jazz bass, because jazz bass has that middle pickup where you can roll the back pickup off, and it's not the same, but it's kind of close. So if I was telling somebody to get one bass, and that's all they could afford, I would go get a road-worn jazz bass, because you can get that P bass thing out of it, and you got a lot of versatility there. But man, walking in with a killer vintage P bass is like, it's always going to work. Mm-hmm. Always.
Yeah.
And it's like I carry little pieces of foam in my bag, and there's I have old P basses with flat wounds on them, but I can make round wound strings kind of sound like flat wounds in a pinch, but I can't make flat wounds sound like round wounds.
Yeah.
So one bass, I would have good round wound strings on it. I would have some foam in my bag where I could tuck it up under the bridge and just boom, boom, get those notes shortened down, play with my thumb up here, just there's so much tone in your right hand. I mean, I'm always moving my right hand. The tone pot, okay, I've got it 30% off. That's darkening and making it sit in the track better. I'll put the foam in here and open that tone up a little bit more, or play up here. Just constantly moving this right hand. Mm-hmm. Closing it down here, controlling length of note. Length of note is huge on bass. Huge.
And what when you're playing and you're making that decision about like the length of the note and how to adjust your playing to support it, what are you listening for in the track that's telling you what to do?
Always have the vocal up. Did they put towels over the drums? If they did, maybe I should pull back with them so I'm not ringing through all that.
So the relationship between the bass and drums, obviously vitally important. What are some things that come to mind when you think about how to have a strong relationship with the drummer?
When we listen to the demo, if there's drums and bass on the demo, sometimes there is, sometimes there's not. I'm listening to the patterns. Like, what are the patterns doing against the vocal, right? And I know the drummer is too. So sometimes we'll talk about it. Sometimes we'll just go out and play the song, and it's so instant. We've done it so long. It's communicating without speaking, and I love that. That's what I love. It's like when I put the headphones on, and I've got a great band, great artist, and a great engineer, and we play the first note. It's just like, holy shit, how do we get this good? It's so cool,
Yeah, it's a great feeling.
But, after the first take, I might look at the drummer and go, hey, in the second verse, so it's an interesting pattern you have there. What are you doing? And I'll either match it or work around it in some way, like weave in and out of the vocal between the kick and the vocal or something.
Are there any other things that come to mind with playing with the relationship between the bass and drums? Let's assume that's a drummer that you don't really know much about.
Right.
What are you listening for as you start playing that first take?
His pocket, right? Is he or she, are they in the middle of the beat? Do they sit on the backside? Are they pushing ahead? It's different now because there's so much copy and paste in the computer world. Mm-hmm. Back in the day when we were playing the tape, it was all about moving with the drummer in the feel, matching his feel. So, man, I'm just listening to where he's putting the beat. Is it in the center? Does he or she tend to play the same patterns when they, like in verse 1, if it's like, if it's that, when verse 2 comes around, is he going back to that? Or is he going to a tom thing? It's like I'm just always listening for patterns, and where he's putting the beat.
And then once you're hearing where that pocket is sitting, then what are some of the other things that you're listening for within that groove that is sort of giving you some idea of where to land your part as far as playing around?
I usually stay pretty hyper focused on the kick drum, because I'm, that's the bass player's world. We're building the house from the foundation up, right? Mm-hmm. That's our job in the rhythm section. So just super hyper focused on the kick, making sure I'm inside that thing, super, super inside the kick.
And when you're finding moments where you're going to step out and allow the bass to kind of make a statement, it depends on the song, depends on the producer's openness to that,
sure.
Sort of thing. But when you're finding those moments, are the things that you're listening for that tell you like, hey, maybe this is a spot where I can bring something out?
Yeah, and I gotta give credit to Charlie Peacock. I don't know if you know who that is.
Of course.
Great producer, and I spent 15 years working with him. He would always have me at some point in the song mirror the vocal, and so that's usually what I'm looking for is there a vocal phrase, whether it's getting on top of the vocal, like really mirroring it, like just out of the blue, you're just catching a phrase, or is it something the vocal's doing where in between the two phrases I can make a statement, and obviously I'm listening to what are the drums doing there. And I don't want to be stepping on anybody else doing things. So those moments are usually pretty quick it's a small statement, but a big statement at the same time.
Managing your schedule can be a pretty challenging thing.
Hardest part of our job.
There's things that are always changing and going up and down. So the one challenging thing with scheduling is having to bail on one thing for another thing and needing to weigh the value of different opportunities. Are there any learning lessons that you've had in that?
If anybody figures that out, please call me and tell me. Because, man, it's like, I was with my youngest son in the truck not long ago. He's a killer musician. He plays cello, and he just made it to the Nashville Youth Symphony. It's awesome.
Wow.
And we were just driving along, and he saw my phone. It was mounted, and a bunch of session calls were coming in. And one was there was 2 or 3 calls for one day, and I was having him respond. I was like, hey, on that one, do this, and on this one, tell him we're checking on it. We've got a hole on that day. And, I'm just doing my normal thing.
Right.
And he just looked at me and went, is this what you do all the time? I said, dude, this is what I do. It's managing that. And, okay, I've got a 3-session demo here. I just got called for a custom record that's really going to pay about the same, but it's going to be way cooler. Do I take that? If a master call comes in, obviously you take that takes precedence, but there's people who give me shit about that. When I bail on that, I've had people question my honor because I had you booked. I'm like, well, yeah, but it's just.
Most people understand that.
Right, most people do.
And for the people that listen, if they're not working in Nashville, a master means a major record.
Right.
Limited pressing session is usually, or custom thing is usually going to be like an independent thing or
low
new
budget
artist.
Master or limited pressing. Those are about the same.
Right.
Demo
and then the
scale.
demo is the songwriters that you're going in to cut 6 songs in 3 hours.
Kind of the lowest common, the lowest denominator.
Right.
But all valuable and all great and all valid and needed, right? Mm-hmm. And I've had the thing happen, and every player that sits in this chair, opposite you, will tell you this, that I bailed on this 3-session demo day to do 2 days of master, and the master's canceled. And that the session's going on without you because they won't wait on you. They've got to move,
Right.
And you're sitting at home like, what am I doing? It's like, shit, and it happens, but so when I bail on something, I usually give it quite a bit of thought, and it's like, okay, I need to take this chance. And now the musicians are finally getting some pretty good back end money. I'm sure guys have told you about that. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty substantial, so when you miss a master now, it's a different deal.
Right.
It's not only are you missing the session, you're missing 5 or 6 years of payment after the fact. Mm-hmm. So good luck. Right. It is really, scheduling is the hardest part of the job.
Yeah. And so when you're having the communication, as you mentioned, some people may give you hell for bailing on something. That really hasn't
happened in a while.
But it's fairly rare. Most for the most part, rare. People aren't going to run across that too much. And if there is someone that's doing that, I'm just going to be stereotypical. They're probably not people that you're going to want to work with long term anyway, because they don't understand the business.
Yep, bingo.
So it wouldn't be as much of a concern. But with the people that that do understand, you still want to show that you care, and that it's not like because it's a challenging thing. We know that you have to do that. Everyone would bail on this greater opportunity that's paying a lot more and has more long-term career value than the smaller thing. But at the same time, you want to have respect for the people that hired you initially. Big and not time. Make them feel like, well, you're not as as important, even though it's not as and balancing that. So are there any ways that you've tried to sympathetically share that news with with folks? How do you approach it?
That is a fantastic question, and yes, there is. So what I started doing maybe 10 years ago is, because I did get somebody questioned my honor, and they actually posted it on Facebook. I'm not a social media guy. I don't do any of it. Just a conscious decision. But this guy posted that me and another guy had bailed on him. He didn't say our names, but it just became this weird thing. I ended up calling him on it. And I called him on the phone. I was like, dude, what? So since that happened, and we're great friends now, it's all good. But since that happened, what I do, and gosh, I just did this yesterday. If I've got let's say I've got a custom record book, 2 days, and I get called for 3 days on Luke Bryan or whatever it is, right? I've got to take that. So what I do is I call a bass player that I know is great, and I book him on the 2 days that I'm bailing on. And I do not tell him who it's for. And I do that because that way I know that they're covered, and they're covered by some kick-ass dude, right? So they can't come to me and go, I can't find anybody, because I've had that happen before.
Right.
So then I call the people I'm bailing on and I say, hey man, got called for 3 days on this. I got to do it. I've got this guy on hold for you. He's available and he's willing to do it. Do you want me to confirm him? So then they may say, yes, that's great. Thank you. Or they may say, no, I want to get somebody else. And I say, okay, let me know when you've got that covered, and I'll release him without holding his schedule up, because I want to be respectful there too.
Right.
And that's worked pretty well, you know, and I don't tell the bass player who I'm calling him for, because if they want to get somebody else, his feelings might get hurt. So I keep it kind of nondescript for a minute until I know what's going to happen. And then I can either confirm or deny them, and they can do their thing, and everybody's pretty happy. And what I've noticed about that is the people I'm bailing on appreciate that I care enough to get it covered. So I know that their session is going to go on without a hitch, right? And just so everybody knows, I've been on the other side of that so many times. Like, I lead sessions, a lot of sessions. I produce sessions. So I've had players bail on me the night before. Oh man, I just got called for 2 days on this. I'm like, go do it. Please go do it. I don't want you here if you're here freaking out that you're not there.
Right.
Right? And that's the bottom line.
Yeah.
I will get somebody to do my session. This town is full of great players.
Right.
It will be fine. So, you know, I experience it too. You know, it just happened to be Saturday. I've got a thing I'm producing in mid-November, and the guy was like, man, I just got called for a bunch of master stuff. I said, take it. Got you covered. No worries.
Yeah, and that's great advice for musician producers, or just producers that are listening too, you know, to take some of that pressure off, you know, knowing that there's plenty of options that where, you know, you may be really bummed, you really wanted this person on this thing, you know, and it sucks, but you can get it taken care of. And the way that you're helping to you know, to do that keeps that relationship strong, and allows them to not have to be worried about if there's not that added stress added to it, you know. You tell them, look, I got to bail on this, but it's covered. And then, because I know for me as a producer, that's the biggest thing. It's like, I know I could get somebody else and that I'll be satisfied with, but are those people going to be available? Now someone just texted me, I'm in the middle of a session all day. I'm not getting out of here until midnight. I'm not going to be able to call the person tomorrow. The session's in 2 days.
Exactly.
And then now I'm stressed because I got to figure it out. Not because I'm upset that the person bailed on something that obviously they need to bail on for. I totally
it's just
get that.
Normal,
but it's a stressful you know, situation. So should that happen a couple times with someone, then there's this unconscious feeling of there may be some stress with this person that can, you know, be built, but that's a great point. You're pulling that out of there, even though we might not even think of it. It's just like we're not thinking of it intentionally.
It's not a personal thing,
but it's just kind of built in. Like, man, the last few times I called, they had to bail on something. Maybe when this next thing comes up, I don't call that person, not because I'm upset with them, but because
you don't want them to deal with it.
There's probably a good possibility they're going to have to bail, and it's not their fault, but that's just going to be more work for me. So I'm going to hire somebody else.
And I've seen that happen on my end too, where a certain person called, they keep calling, they book me, and I get called for something that's master or whatever. And it's just like, oh man, I got to call them again and bail. And I feel terrible, because every call that comes into my phone, I appreciate, and always have, always will. Even a call like this, you know, it's like they care about what I think, you know, they want me to play, whatever. I care about that. But, you know, you're weighing out what is going to move my career forward, you know, and it's not all about money. It's not that, but
right. Which is a good thing, which I was going to ask. So like when you really have that vision of, you have to balance all of these things, and it's not always what pays the most right now. And it's a really important thing, I think, for players to understand, especially early on, but also long-term, because I think it happens both ways.
It does.
Early on, you're looking at that, and then you may turn down something that had really great long-term opportunity, but you were so focused on, on that. And then later on in your career, you may be so comfortable and you have that set value in your mind of what your time, which is totally reasonable.
Yeah.
But then you can also get stuck in that spot where you've lost that, or not you, but like players could lose that, just like authentic excitement about something that really moves them musically. And then you find yourself spending so much time getting paid really well for maybe some projects that you're not as musically inspired around, and then you don't deliver as well. And then that ends up kind of being the downfall over time, as opposed to finding things that are going to continue to creatively excite you and stuff,
Well, and like a good example is I might get a master call from a producer I've worked for 25 years, and we've done so much work together, and maybe it's a artist that's on the downside of his career, something like that. And this is totally hypothetical, but I get a call from a producer that's just moved to town. He's a young guy, and he's got 2 hits on the radio right now, but it's just a demo. I'm going to take that, right? Mm-hmm. I'm going to let the other thing go. That's more money, because cultivating this new relationship might be more important long-term. And I've done that many times where I'm like, no, I'm going to stick with this. It's not paying as much, but I don't really care. I want to see where this goes. Because there's new guys moving, especially now, like half of LA and New York's moving here. It's like, are you kidding me? And all that comes with new young talent that they get comfort out of calling these guys that have done this for so long.
Yeah, it's a lot to balance.
Keep that phone ringing as freaking long as I can, man. Right?
Yeah,
get my Rugrats through college, man.
So when you got into leading sessions and producing sessions, when in your career did that start to happen, and what led to that?
No conscious decision. I've always been enamored with the production side of things. So I've produced a couple of pretty fun projects, and I started leading sessions just organically. It was like somebody said, hey, I usually lead this dude's sessions. I can't do this one. He said, ask Hill if he'll lead it. And I was like, okay, I do charts. I've done charts forever. And that's really what it is you do the charts and you make the calls, and you just organizational skills, make sure that you're getting the song count for the writer or producer or whatever it is, and keeping the session moving. That's really it. There are certain guys I decided I didn't want to lead for, just because I like doing their sessions. I don't want the responsibility on that session, not because I don't like them. It's just, I want to play. I don't want to do that. I just want to play. Mm-hmm. So it's a specific thing.
Yeah.
There's been many times I've been called and it's like, hey, I want you to do these sessions on this and this day, and can you lead it? Well, I've just finished 5 12-hour days. And that means at the end of that 5th day, I'm going to come home and chart the songs for that session, those sessions he wants me to lead. I don't want to do that. I'm worn out. It's like, I want to come home and sit back and relax and not have to worry about making the reminder calls. And I don't want that responsibility at that time. So it's, and there've been times when I've been booked as a leader, and that's happened where it's just the sessions leading up to that got crazy. And I just called the producer and said, hey, who else is playing on this session? Whatever, call him and let him lead. I'm wiped out. And he's like, oh, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
He'd rather me do that than be there half-assed,
right.
Which is what would happen. Because I was like, crazy tired.
Right. Which brings up the idea of finding balance. It's a very challenging industry to break into. There's long hours. It doesn't necessarily feel like that in the moment because we're doing what we love and hanging out, and
so cool.
A 12-hour day goes by and what feels like 2 hours, it's like the coolest job in the world.
Yeah.
I think. But there's still a threshold of just capacity that we have mentally, creatively. Are there any things that you've found to be important to be able to maintain a balance that allows you to stay creative and stay inspired about doing this every day?
Well, I think early on, when I was talking about the arc of the session player, when you get here or wherever you go and you start climbing that ladder, you'll do anything, and I even played free for people that I'd never met once. They called me back, it's on you,
right.
But when you're climbing that ladder, it's like I did everything, Sunday sessions, Saturday night, 4 sessions in a day, 10, 2, 6, and a 10. I did that a couple times. Crazy long day. Mm-hmm. So, but then you get to a certain point where you've worked so much and you do just get mentally exhausted. Everybody's like, oh, it must be nice to not have to work for a living. I'm like, dude, you go sit with a really picky producer for 12 hours in a day and feel how your back feels. And, you're just like, oh God. So, but once you get to that kind of level where you can kind of like, okay, I'm going to do this I'm not going to do, I just had 5 3-session days and somebody just said, hey, will you come play with me at 3rd and Lindsley Saturday night? I'm like, no, I won't. I'm going to chill Saturday night, so, but I think once you get to a certain point where you can kind of start making those calls, like I'm going to do this, I'm not going to do that. And, it is a tough business, and I'm guilty, certainly, of just doing too much. But the older I get, the more I kind of distill it to what I want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. What do you do outside of music to keep your...
Big outdoors guy. I own a farm about an hour south of here, 83 acres, got a log cabin on it. And we got 4-wheelers out there. We just go out there and let loose, just ride and have fun. Probably live out there one day. I live in Franklin now, but I love it out there. Yeah. It's a magical place to me. I grew up on 2,000 acres. So, when I moved here into a subdivision, it was like, holy shit. It was like, oh my God. It might as well have been New York City to me, which it's not. But so, yeah, when I toured with Keith Urban, I was his band leader. And, it was a pretty good paying gig and all at once. And I came home and bought that down in a little town called Lewisburg. And it's just awesome. It's so awesome. Yeah. So that's, just hang out with the boys and go 4-wheeling.
Yeah. I find that for a lot of us, like outdoors is because we're indoors, like 90% of our life. Kidding. Yeah. Like outdoors is like the great escape,
And we're always people, it's such a people industry. Right. And, I can get a little bit reclusive, just the way I am. And so that to me, it's just like this moment of, okay, I'm going to go out here. All I got is cows and trees. It's just like, oh, cool. Just chill for a minute. So,
right. So we were talking earlier, like this morning before you came over, you were doing a session from home,
right?
Using audio movers with a client on there with you and, and working through it. That's become a necessity now for the professional session player to be able to record from home and in the studio.
Yeah.
When did you start to roll into doing more of that at home sort of stuff? And how did you get your setup together?
Man, many years ago. I mean, I've always had a studio in my house of some kind, even when I was back in Illinois, growing up. But it's so easy now. The technology is so great. I had a production company with a Grammy-winning engineer, and he and I had a studio together for a while. So that was great and bad all at the same time because I was so lazy about, how does this work? What's signal flow? I don't know. He does it, right? But he kind of left abruptly and it was like, oh shit, I got some stuff to learn, But that was great because I realized how much I had depended on him for speaker selection, mic selection. What cables do you use? How's it set up? And I just totally dove into it and learned it, and I'm not saying I've learned everything. I'm not a mix guy. I have done a little bit of that, but it's not something I really aspire to do. So I usually farm that out, but just like learning the audio movers thing and figuring out how to do all that, that was always given to somebody else before. I never had to do that. So in the last 5 years, I've really kind of dove into it and learned it better.
Right. So when you're recording bass, the acoustics of the room are maybe a little less important than like if you're recording an acoustic guitar or a piano or something like that. But you still need a solid listening environment to be able to monitor, what you're playing and stuff. What goes into like the acoustic setup of your home studio? Okay,
so my home studio was built by a studio builder, so it's not near this big, but it's treated to a certain degree. And I can cut drums, and, you know, I've got a vocal room, and I've got a guitar cabinet isolated and all that kind of stuff. But for me, man, it's like, what does it sound like where I sit? Because I love good sounding speakers, and it's for bass, it's like it's got to thump, it's got to, you know, punch and be great. But a lot of the newer modern speakers that have the Class D power amps in them, the powered speakers, when I get it feeling great, they clip, you know, and I'm just like, shit, they sound great, but when I get it feeling good, they clip. It's like, it drives me crazy. So I finally wound up with the Chris Lord-Alge NS10s, which I know everybody's probably going, for bass? Are you kidding me? But back in the 90s, it was an engineer that I used to work with a lot that had the old school NS10s with an 18-inch sub, and it was my favorite. I could sit there in front of those and get mid-punch out of those NS10s and feel the bottom of the sub. It was fantastic. So that's what I got those. I went through several different sets of speakers. There was Focals that I had that I really loved, but they clipped. And dude, the sound of that tweeter clipping, that thing was just like, oh, I just want to throw them out the window. I hated it.
Right.
So these CLA 10s have a Class A power amp in them. They're more like the old power amps we used to use. And they're not, I don't think it's a digital power amp. I think it's analog, whatever. I don't know. So I've got that with a sub. And they're great. You know, for me, they're perfect. It's perfect amount of mid punch and good power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What type of like interface and like signal chain? Is it a similar signal chain to what you bring in the studio that you use when you're recording at home?
No, not really. I mean, yes and no. Interface-wise, I'm a diehard Apogee guy. When I was out on the road, I got this little Apogee interface called a One. And I took a Demeter Tube DI or something with me. I was like, I got to warm this up somehow. I was like, this is going to sound like shit. So cutting bass tracks in a hotel room, right? And I'm going through a bunch of stuff, hitting this Apogee, and it just was not working. I was like, hang on a minute. So I pull out of the Tube DI and I plug straight into the Apogee. Holy crap. Killer. This thing is the size of an iPhone. Sounds like an API. I mean, it sounds just like an API to me, to my ears. So I ended up outfitting my studio with all Apogee pre's. It's interface and pre's all together. And I love them. I just love them.
Nice.
I A-B'd. I used to have some APIs, and I cut a acoustic part with acoustic bass and a vocal part with the APIs. And then I cut them through the Apogees. And then I had somebody switch them back and forth, and I picked the Apogee every time.
So when you're working on remote stuff, sometimes rarely you're going to have the client with you. A lot of times you're going to be working by yourself. When you're working with someone that you don't already know everything about. So I'm sure a lot of these days, a lot of the calls you're getting are from producers that you've worked with for a long time. You sort of know, you've worked with them in the studio, so you have a good instinct for what they're going for. Those sort of remote sessions are fairly straightforward because you can guess what they're going to want.
Yeah.
For someone that is that you're working with that's new or you may not know, what sort of preparation and questions and conversation do you have with someone before you jump into doing a remote session where they're not going to be actually there with you, but you're going to be doing it on your own?
Right. This guy today, this was a new guy. And he wanted to FaceTime, and he wanted to be able to listen to the session while we did it. He was just at Music Row. I could have gone down there, I guess, but it was like, I don't know. We just did it this way. Had no idea what the songs were. We got together at 9:45. You know, like, I'm going to send you a link. He sends me a link to the song. I download it. I get a mix going, get a bass tone going. Then I call him, FaceTime, and then send him the link to log into the session. First song was very, very standard, and I played one pass, and he was like, oh, that's great, man. Love the tone. Do this. Don't come into the second verse. You know, play the intro and then come in back. I was like, great. So I did another pass. He was like, that's perfect. Sends me the next song, and it's more of a Keith Urban, what I perceived as really rock, right? So I was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to do my thing. So I cranked the input of that Acme up. I go to my Kling Helm producers. I don't know if you, or compressors. I don't know if you use those. It's a software-based killer. I use it on everything. Love it. The 1176 version of that with some distortion on it. And I start this track and then I get it going, get a mix going, start the track, call him. He's like, oh, yeah, man, I don't want this rock. And I was like, oh shit. Okay. No, cool. You know, we'll So I do everything back to where I had it and then just kind of play it with my fingers. I picked up a pick and just really was, and he was like, no, I don't want that. Okay, great. So I guessed and missed, which is part of the gig,
So when you think about the extent of your career so far, the future of your career moving forward, if there was something that you could tell yourself back then that would allow you to, what comes to mind that would be like the thing that you wish you would have known when you were starting?
Yeah, and this is what I tell my boys all the time. It's like, never, ever create enemies. And I've never consciously created an enemy. Like I said something to this girl that I was working for one time. I said something about her song being country. And she pissed her off. She never called me again. And I was like, the guy that facilitated those sessions, I saw him one day. I said, what happened to Marianne Kennedy? And he said, oh, you remember when you said her song was country? I was like, vaguely. It wasn't a slam. It was like, I was telling her how much I loved her song. She was trying to get out of country at the time, and I created an enemy without even realizing it, So I'm just very careful about off the cuff comments. It's just like, if there's something I don't like, I just don't say anything, but I always try to find something where I can tip the hat and go, wow, that's cool, but don't ever create enemies. I've seen so many times, been in a studio with a second engineer sitting in the corner that's quiet, and 5 years later, he's up getting a Grammy. I'm like, was that the dude I didn't know he was, So
right.
Always treating people well. I mean, I grew up that way anyway, but,
right.
just always treating people well. And
yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's great advice too. And you mentioned that because it's like in the commercial studio world, interns are sort of like told by the studio managers to be like invisible and like shadows in the back of the room. Don't speak to anyone. Don't look at anyone.
I usually buy their lunch.
And
I do. Right. It's like, I know they're struggling and it's like, dude, come to lunch, whatever.
Yeah. So, and just those small gestures of just appreciating all the people that are around, and remembering that dude that's sweeping the floors could very much be hiring you,
Absolutely.
a few years from now.
And I've seen that happen
right
in my own career. I worked at this studio called the Bennett House. Keith Thomas, I don't know if you know who that is.
Mm-hmm.
He used to own it and killer place. And a kid there named Sean Schenkel, kind of cleaning up tracks or whatever, and he wound up being a great producer.
Yeah.
And he used me, because I was kind to him,
Right.
Just said, hey, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Love it, man.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much,
dude,
for joining us. This is a great conversation. I know people are gonna love it. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you, man.
Thank you.